Have you ever wondered how close you've come to danger without even realizing it? At Shivering Vault, we take you there, one story at a time. But before you drift off, consider liking this video and commenting where you're watching from. Now, let's dive into these chilling stories. My friends and I decided to go camping last summer, deep in the woods of Illinois. None of us were experienced campers, but we thought it'd be a fun escape from the city. It was me, my best friend Jason, his girlfriend Amber, and her cousin Matt. Jason was the one who picked the spot, some state park I can't even remember the name of, but it was about 2 hours from Chicago. We all piled into Jason's old Jeep with our gear and a cooler full of drinks, ready for an adventure. The first day was honestly great. We hiked, set up our tents, and cooked hot dogs over the fire. It was one of those clear summer nights where the stars seemed to go on forever. The woods were quiet, except for the usual sounds of crickets and frogs. Around midnight, we all crawled into our tents. Jason and Amber shared one, and Matt and I were in the other. I remember lying there, staring at the tent ceiling, just listening to the sounds outside. At first, it was peaceful. Then, somewhere in the distance, I heard what sounded like footsteps. At first, I told myself it was probably just an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon. But the sound wasn't random. It had a rhythm, like someone walking. I whispered to Matt, asking if he heard it, but he was already snoring. I lay there, heart pounding, listening to those steps circle around the camp. I thought about waking Jason, but I didn't want to look paranoid, so I stayed quiet, telling myself it was nothing. Eventually, the footsteps faded, and I fell asleep. The next morning, I didn't mention it. We spent the day exploring a nearby lake and fishing, and by the time we got back to camp, I'd almost forgotten about it. But that night, it happened again. This time, the footsteps were closer. They weren't just circling the camp. They were stopping and starting, like whoever, or whatever, was out there was trying to be sneaky. I sat up in my sleeping bag, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped right outside our tent. I held my breath, too scared to even move. The tent was thin, just a layer of fabric between me and whoever, or whatever, was out there. I could hear the soft crunch of leaves, and I swear I saw the faintest shadow through the fabric. "Matt," I whispered, shaking his shoulder. "Wake up." He groaned and rolled over, half asleep. "What?" "There's someone outside," I hissed. Matt sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes. The sound of the footsteps had stopped, but I could still feel the tension in the air. He listened for a moment, then shook his head. "Probably just a deer or something. Go back to sleep." I wanted to argue, but what could I say? I didn't have proof. I lay back down, but I couldn't relax. Every little sound made my heart race. The next morning, I finally brought it up to the group. "I swear, someone was walking around our camp last night," I told them over breakfast. Jason laughed. "Man, you've been watching too many horror movies." Amber rolled her eyes. "It's the woods. Animals move around at night. It's normal." Even Matt didn't back me up. "I didn't hear anything," he said, shrugging. I dropped it. But the uneasy feeling stayed with me. That evening, Jason suggested we build a bigger fire and stay up late telling stories. He was trying to lighten the mood, but I couldn't shake the feeling we weren't alone. The forest seemed darker than the night before, the trees casting long shadows that stretched toward us. Around midnight, Amber got tired and went to bed. Jason and Matt stayed up talking, but I decided to turn in too. I was exhausted from barely sleeping the night before. It didn't take long for the footsteps to return. This time, I knew it wasn't an animal. The steps were slow and deliberate, like someone was trying not to be heard. I peeked out through a tiny gap in the tent zipper, but it was too dark to see anything. The fire had burned down to embers, and the woods were pitch black. "Matt," I whispered again, shaking him harder this time. "Wake up." He grumbled but sat up, clearly annoyed. "Listen," I said, my voice shaking. He paused, frowning as he finally heard the soft crunch of footsteps. His expression changed instantly. "What the hell?" he muttered. We both froze, listening. The footsteps stopped right outside our tent again. "Who's out there?" Matt called, trying to sound tough. No answer. "Jason?" He tried again. Still nothing. Matt grabbed the flashlight from his bag and unzipped the tent, shining it outside. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was no one there. "I told you," I whispered. Matt stepped out cautiously, shining the light around. The forest seemed empty. "Probably just some animal," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. He crawled back into the tent, zipping it up tightly. But I couldn't sleep, not after that. The rest of the night dragged on. Every noise outside sent my heart racing, but the footsteps didn't return, or if they did, I didn't hear them. When morning finally came, I felt like a zombie. Jason and Amber teased me the whole morning for freaking out over nothing. Even Matt, who had clearly been rattled last night, started acting like it wasn't a big deal. "Let's just finish the trip," Jason said as we packed up our gear to go hiking. "You're letting your imagination ruin this for you." I didn't argue, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I noticed little things, like how quiet the woods were. The birds, the bugs, everything seemed muted. Even the wind barely rustled the trees. We hiked for a few hours, following a narrow trail that looped back toward our campsite. As we walked, I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder, feeling like we were being watched. At one point, we passed a couple coming from the opposite direction. They looked like seasoned campers. Backpacks, walking sticks, the whole deal. As they passed, the woman stopped and glanced at us. "You kids camping out here?" she asked. Jason nodded. "Yeah, just a few nights. Why?" The woman hesitated, then gave a tight smile. "Be careful. We've heard some strange stories about this area." "What kind of stories?" I blurted, my stomach twisting. She hesitated again, then shook her head. "Just don't wander too far from your campsite. Stay safe." With that, she and her partner continued down the trail, leaving us in an uneasy silence. "See?" I said, breaking the quiet. "I'm not crazy." Jason rolled his eyes. "She's just trying to freak us out. Probably locals messing with campers." But I could tell even he was a little unnerved. When we got back to the site, it was late afternoon. Jason and Matt decided to gather more firewood, leaving Amber and me to hang out at camp. I offered to help with the firewood, but Jason insisted we'd be fine. Amber sat on a log scrolling through her phone while I tried to relax. But as the sun dipped lower, I started to feel that same heaviness in the air, the kind that made your skin crawl. That's when I noticed it. On the ground, just outside the edge of our camp, were footprints. Not animal tracks, human ones. "Amber?" "What?" she replied without looking up. "Come here," I said, pointing to the ground. She sighed and stood up, walking over. When she saw the prints, her face went pale. "They weren't here before," I said. Maybe they're Jason's or Matt's, she said, though she didn't sound convinced. I shook my head. No, look, they're fresh. The prints led away from our camp, disappearing into the woods. I felt my stomach drop. Should we call them back? Amber asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Before I could answer, we heard a branch snap somewhere in the distance. Jason? She called out. Matt? No response. Amber and I stood frozen, staring in the direction of the sound. It was distant, but close enough to send a chill down my spine. Jason? Matt? Amber called again, louder this time. Nothing. We should call them, she said, fumbling for her phone. Her hands were shaking so much she nearly dropped it. I pulled out my phone too, but there was no service. We were too deep in the woods. Amber's phone was the same, just an endless searching at the top of the screen. Okay, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Let's just wait here. They'll be back soon. Amber nodded, but I could tell she was panicking. We both sat down by the fire pit, facing the direction Jason and Matt had gone, listening for any sound of them coming back. The forest was eerily quiet now. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the faintest whisper of the wind. Minutes dragged by, each one feeling like an hour. Then we heard it. Footsteps. Amber shot up, her eyes wide. Jason? She called. The footsteps didn't answer. They were slow, deliberate, crunching leaves underfoot. Whoever it was, they weren't in any hurry. Hello? I called, trying to sound braver than I felt. The footsteps stopped. Amber grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. This isn't funny, she shouted. For a moment, everything was still. Then we heard a low voice, somewhere just beyond the trees. Help me, it said. It was quiet, almost a whisper, but clear enough to send a jolt of fear through me. Did you hear that? Amber whispered. Yeah, I said, my mouth dry. Jason? She called again, her voice cracking. Help me, the voice repeated. It sounded off somehow, like someone trying to mimic a voice, but not quite getting it right. Something's wrong, I said, pulling Amber back toward the center of the camp. We need to stay here until they come back. Amber nodded, her face pale. We both stood there, gripping our phones like they were lifelines, staring at the darkening woods. The footsteps started again, this time moving closer. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. Stay behind me, I told Amber, even though I had no idea what I'd do if someone came out of the trees. The footsteps stopped just beyond the glow of the campfire. For a moment, everything was still. Then a man stepped into the light. He wasn't Jason or Matt. Amber gasped, stumbling backward, and I instinctively stepped in front of her. The man was tall and wiry, dressed in dirty clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. His face was partially hidden under the brim of a baseball cap, but I could see enough to know something wasn't right. He stood there, just outside the light of the campfire, staring at us, without saying a word. Who are you? I asked, my voice trembling. What do you want? He didn't answer. Instead, he took one slow step forward, his boots crunching on the dirt. Stop! I shouted, holding up my hand like that would do anything. The man tilted his head, almost like he was amused, then took another step closer. Amber was crying now, clutching my arm. What do we do? She whispered, her voice barely audible. I was frozen. Every instinct was screaming at me to run, but I couldn't leave her. The man finally spoke, his voice low and gravelly. Nice night for a campfire. My stomach twisted. The way he said it didn't sound friendly. It sounded like a threat. "Jason and Matt will be back any second," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You should leave." The man didn't move. He just stared at us, his mouth curling into a slow, unsettling smile. Then, without warning, he lunged. Amber screamed, and I stumbled backward, grabbing the nearest thing I could find, a heavy stick from the fire pit. I swung it wildly, and the man flinched, stepping back just enough for me to grab Amber's hand. "Run!" I shouted. We bolted into the woods, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. I didn't know where we were going, just away from the camp, away from him. Branches tore at my arms and face as we ran, the sound of our frantic footsteps echoing through the trees. I could hear him behind us, crashing through the underbrush. Amber tripped and fell, pulling me down with her. "Get up!" I yelled, yanking her to her feet. But it was too late. I felt a hand grab my arm, yanking me backwards so hard I thought my shoulder might pop out of its socket. Amber screamed, but she couldn't do anything. The man was strong. Stronger than I expected. He wrapped his arm around my neck, dragging me back toward the campsite. I thrashed and kicked, trying to break free, but he held on tight. My vision blurred as I struggled for air. "Let him go!" Amber screamed, picking up a rock and hurling it at the man. It hit him square in the head, and he stumbled, loosening his grip just enough for me to break free. I didn't think, I just ran, grabbing Amber's hand and dragging her with me. Somehow we made it back to the trail. I didn't stop running until I saw headlights in the distance. A car parked at one of the trailheads. We burst out of the woods, screaming for help. A couple loading their car turned to us, startled. "There's a man," I gasped. He tried to grab us. The couple immediately called 911. The man must have realized we'd gotten away because by the time the police arrived, he was long gone. The police took our statements while Amber and I sat shivering in the couple's car. Jason and Matt returned to the trailhead about 30 minutes later, looking panicked. They'd come back to camp and found it in disarray, with no sign of us. The officers searched the area and found more footprints near our campsite. They said it looked like someone had been watching us for a while, lurking just out of sight. It didn't take long for them to connect our story to a man who'd been spotted in the area over the past few weeks. He'd been harassing hikers and campers, but this was the first time he'd tried to abduct someone. A few days later, they caught him a few miles from the trailhead, living out of a run-down van. When the police showed us his mugshot, I felt sick. It was definitely him. The man from the woods. They said he had a history of violent offenses, including assault and stalking. He'd been released from prison a few months earlier and had been drifting between campsites, targeting anyone who seemed vulnerable. Amber and I were lucky. Jason and Matt apologized profusely for leaving us alone, and while I forgave them, things were never quite the same after that. I haven't been camping since. Even now, years later, I can't step into the woods without feeling like someone's watching me. Sometimes I lie awake at night, replaying the moment he grabbed me. The way his grip tightened, the way his voice sounded when he spoke. It's burned into my memory. I try to tell myself it's over, that he's in prison and can't hurt anyone anymore. But every time I close my eyes, I see his face, and I wonder how many others weren't as lucky as we were. I had never been the type of person to get freaked out easily, but that night, out at Cache River Wetlands in southern Illinois, changed everything. I had been camping with my buddy Jason. We were both big outdoorsy types, and after months of hearing about the beauty of the wetlands, we finally made the trip. The plan was simple: set up camp, enjoy the quiet, maybe fish a little, and just escape for a weekend. We arrived late in the afternoon, just in time to set up our tents before the sun started dipping. It was an amazing spot, surrounded by trees with the sound of the river in the background. The weather was perfect, cool but not too cold, and we were feeling good. We cooked a simple dinner over the campfire, shared a couple beers, and joked around like we always do. As the night wore on, we both got tired, so we decided to head to bed. Jason climbed into his tent first, while I hung around the fire for a few extra minutes. The woods had that peaceful stillness to them, that kind of quiet where the only noise you hear is the wind rustling through the trees. I remember lying in my sleeping bag, feeling pretty cozy and safe. We had the whole place to ourselves, or at least I thought we did. Around 2 a.m. I woke up to a sound that made my heart stop. It was like something sniffing the air. At first I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again. A deep, heavy inhale. I lay there in the dark, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe an animal, maybe a raccoon or something small. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was closer than that. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly unzipped the flap of my tent. Just a crack, enough to peek outside. I saw nothing but the dark outline of trees and the slight sway of branches. For a second, I almost convinced myself I was imagining things. But then I heard it again. The sound of something big moving around outside. It wasn't a small animal, that's for sure. I froze. My stomach sank. I listened closely and heard the sniffing sound again. This time, it was closer. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears. I didn't know what to do. The noise was so distinct, like the creature was taking in deep breaths, sniffing the air as if searching for something. But it wasn't the sound of a deer or raccoon. It was something much heavier, much more deliberate. I decided to get a better look. I pulled back the tent flap just a little more, barely enough to get my flashlight through. What I saw next made my stomach drop. There, in the shadows, was a massive black shape. A bear. It was huge, at least 10 feet away from me. It was bent over, sniffing around the pile of food we had left out. I thought I had stored everything in the bear box, but I must have missed something, or maybe it got knocked over. The bear's huge black head was turned away from me, but I could hear it munching on something. For a second, I just froze. I couldn't believe it. I had heard stories of bears in the area, but never thought one would wander so close to camp, especially at night. I tried to stay as still as possible, hoping it wouldn't notice me. I slowly pulled my head back into the tent, trying not to make a sound. But just as I was about to zip it up, the bear looked up. Its eyes locked onto mine. I don't know what happened next, but all I could think was, I need to get away. I scrambled to the back of the tent, trying not to panic, but it was too late. The bear stood up on its hind legs, towering over everything, and it let out a deep, menacing growl. I could hear the sound of its claws scraping the dirt as it moved closer. Without thinking, I shot up and bolted for the trees. I didn't know where I was going. I wasn't thinking about a plan. I just knew I needed to get away from that bear. Jason was still in his tent, but when I ran past his sight, I heard him shout my name in confusion. I didn't stop to explain. I couldn't. The bear was still close behind me, and I could hear it crashing through the brush. I knew I had to move fast. I ran for what felt like forever, my legs burning, but I could hear the bear crashing through the brush behind me. Every few steps, I'd hear the snuffling sound again, closer. It was like the bear was hunting me, following my scent. I found a tree, a big one. I didn't even think about it. I just scrambled up, my heart pounding in my chest. I got about 10 feet up before I heard the bear's footsteps stop below me. I stayed as still as I could, holding onto the tree with everything I had, my arms aching. I could hear the bear snorting and grunting below me, its hot breath rising in clouds in the cool night air. It stayed there for what felt like hours, pacing around the base of the tree. I didn't dare move. I don't even know how long I was up there, but I was too scared to even look down. Eventually, I heard Jason's voice, faint at first, calling out my name. It took him a while to realize what was going on, and I was too high up to answer him properly. I whispered down, too afraid to make a louder noise. When he finally realized what was happening, he shouted for help, but it didn't seem like the bear was going to leave anytime soon. Finally, I heard the sound of another voice from the distance. It was a ranger calling out to us. The bear paused, sniffed the air one last time, and then, much to my relief, wandered off into the woods. Jason had made his way to where I was stuck in the tree, trying to make sure I was okay. I felt bad for not telling him what I was doing earlier, but honestly, I didn't have the time. The ranger arrived, and I could barely hold onto the tree anymore. My ankle had twisted when I first climbed up, and I couldn't stop shaking. The ranger helped me down, clearly freaked out by the whole situation, and I didn't even care how embarrassed I felt at the time. Later, I found out that the bear had been spotted a few times in the area and had attacked a couple of campers in the past. The ranger said I was lucky to get away with just a sprained ankle. Jason and I packed up the next morning, both of us a little shaken. That was the last camping trip I ever went on, and it's safe to say Jason probably won't be inviting me again anytime soon. I've never been a big camper, but I've always wanted to try something more secluded, away from the crowds. So when I decided to go camping alone near Shawnee National Forest in Illinois, I thought it would be the perfect escape. No people, no distractions, just me and nature. I set up camp in the late afternoon near a small creek that I thought would be peaceful. The first night was perfect. The sky was clear and the temperature was just right. I didn't feel scared at all, even though I was by myself. I made some soup, listened to the wind rustling through the trees, and tried to relax. There was something comforting about the isolation. But then the next morning came. I woke up to a thick fog. It had rolled in overnight, completely surrounding my camp. It was so dense that I could barely see the trees around me, and there was no sound. Nothing. The usual chirping of birds, the breeze through the branches. Everything was just still. I tried to shake it off as just weather, but something felt wrong. The silence was oppressive. I couldn't even hear the creek anymore. It was like the forest had completely shut off. Still, I thought maybe a walk might clear my head, so I grabbed my gear and decided to head out. The plan was to hike a little, get a feel for the area, and just enjoy the quiet. The trail wasn't marked all that well, but I wasn't too worried. I had a general idea of the area and had done some research beforehand. At first, everything seemed fine. The fog didn't seem to get any worse, and the trail was easy to follow. But after a while, I noticed that there was something off. The trees all started to look the same. The trail itself got harder to see, and the fog began to get thicker. It was like the forest was swallowing me whole. I couldn't tell if I was still on the trail or not. The further I walked, the more disoriented I became. It was strange. Everything felt familiar, but nothing felt right. I kept walking for hours. I had no idea where I was anymore. The trees all blurred together, and every turn seemed to lead me deeper into the fog. I couldn't see anything beyond a few feet in front of me. My heart started racing. I tried to stay calm, but my mind was spinning. I thought about turning back, but the problem was I couldn't remember which direction I had come from. Every tree looked the same. There were no markers, no signs. And every time I tried to backtrack, I ended up going in circles. It didn't make sense, but it was happening. Hours turned into an entire day. I barely ate anything, and I started to feel the effects of dehydration. I had enough water to last me through the morning, but now I was running low. The fog still hadn't lifted, and I couldn't get a clear view of anything. My sense of time was completely messed up, and the isolation started to sink in. I had no one to call. My phone had no service out here, and I didn't even have the strength to shout for help. I kept walking, hoping to find a way out. But the more I walked, the more the forest felt like it was pulling me deeper. At one point, I thought I saw a break in the trees ahead, maybe a clearing, maybe the trail. But when I got there, it was just more trees, more fog. By the second night, I was exhausted. My legs were sore, and I felt like I was running on empty. I curled up near a tree and tried to sleep, but the fear kept me up. It wasn't just the fog. It was the feeling that something wasn't right. I couldn't shake the thought that I was completely and utterly lost, with no way to get back. On the third day, I was barely able to keep my eyes open. The fog hadn't lifted, and I still couldn't find any recognizable landmarks. I couldn't even hear the forest anymore. It was like the whole world had turned into a gray, silent void. My water was gone, and I was starving. That's when I finally admitted to myself that I wasn't going to get out of this alone. I don't know how long I'd been wandering at that point. My sense of time was shot. But just when I was about to give up, I thought I heard voices. They were faint at first, but then they got closer. I couldn't believe it. I thought I was hearing things, but no, it was real. There were people. The search party found me around noon. I don't even remember how they got to me. Everything was a blur. They told me that they'd been looking for me for 2 days. Apparently, when I hadn't checked in by the time I was supposed to come back, my family and some friends got worried. They reached out to local authorities, who eventually called in a search team to track me down. I had no idea that anyone even noticed I was missing. I was in bad shape. They gave me water, food, and some first aid. I didn't even have the energy to thank them. I was just relieved to be found. Turns out I had wandered into a part of Shawnee that was known for being difficult to navigate, especially when the fog rolled in. There were no obvious trail markers, and the dense forest can mess with your sense of direction. It wasn't until I was found that I learned how easily people can get lost in that area. I don't think I've ever been more scared in my life than I was in those 2 days. It felt like the forest was playing tricks on me, like I was never meant to leave. I've always loved the outdoors, but after this trip, I have a lot more respect for nature and for Shawnee National Forest. It wasn't a place to mess around in, especially alone. That's it for today's tale from Shivering Vault. If you have a story worth sharing, drop it in the comments or send it our way. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your fellow thrill seekers. As always, the Shivering Vault thanks you for unlocking today's tale. Until next time, the vault awaits your return.